Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to this beautiful place. Today, we will be a bit further from the primeval forests, from the very nice, beautiful places, with some exceptions. I will not spoil it too much, but we will talk about woody plant invasions in temperate forests, the drivers and impacts. In general, worldwide, we have a very big and increasing problems with biological invasions. I will not tell you about all numbers that are. I just show you three, the most worthy to remember from the latest IPBES report on invasive species impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem services. Biological invasions are responsible for 16% of all global extinctions. Their costs are over $400 billion yearly. It is not only cost of the management, but also cost of the economic losses caused by this species. And also, these guys who provided this report analyzed over 40,000 impacts in the literature, and they found that 85% of the impacts of invasive species that cannot be evaluated are negative. Therefore, we all want to act. We want to do something with invasive species. But it's easy to act, but not easy to act smart and successfully. If we want to act, we need to know what is the threat, which means what is the particular impact of invasive species, what are the mechanisms. We need to know why there are invasive species in a particular place. So we need to know what drives invasive species if we want to go into the very successful management. I will not tell you so much about how to manage invasive species, how to eradicate them successfully, because this is not the area of my expertise, but drivers and impacts. If we go into the literature, we can say that generally there are three groups of biological invasion drivers. First group is related with the species. The life history traits can determine the invasiveness or can help the species be invasive, but also there are some other things that are not considered as life history traits or functional traits like age of reproduction, seed production, but also usefulness for human, because for biological invasion, the first step is transport the species from the native range to the secondary range. And usually it is not only connected with the accidental transport, but for the purpose introduction. Another element of this triangle of the invasion is habitat invasibility, whether the focal site is vulnerable or not vulnerable. It can be usually connected with resources availability like light, nitrogen, moisture, temperature, but also all network of biotic interactions with pathogens, with competition, herbivory, also disturbance regime. The third element is propagal pressure, because whether we will plant one black cherry or 10,000 black cherries on 1 hectare, it will determine the number of the seed that will be produced, number of the vegetative organs that will be able to spread. So if we look on this like the kind of lottery, the more coupons for lottery we will buy, the higher will be chance that we will win. I will start with species invasiveness. We can assume that some traits allow us to predict whether the species will be invasive or not, because invasive species share some trait similarities. In 1974, Baker developed a concept of ideal weed. He listed 10 or 15 characteristics of species that facilitate the biological invasions. Of course, from the evolutionary point of view, the species that share all of this adaptation for spread would be a Darwin's nightmare, would be perfectly adapted species, and because of trade-offs, it would not exist. If we assume that biological invasion is totally dependent on species traits, biological invasions should be deterministic. And we could easily make a risk assessment, take the list of species traits, make a simple model that will solve everything, and we will know this species can be invasive, this species cannot be invasive. And it seems that it's an easy job. I would say that this is a holy grail of invasion ecology. Of course, there are plenty of papers like that, and usually the models of invasion success or naturalization success is explained not only by the traits or only in the several percent. Therefore, researchers are still struggling to develop this ideal model. I also fall in this trap of easy making the model based on the traits. But there are, if we go from the global or regional level of all habitats down into the subset of species, we can see some trends. There's a nice study by Paula Teco and co-authors that identified some trends in woody invaders comparing with native woody species. They found that woody invaders differ from native woody species in the plant economic spectrum. Invaders have lower leaf thickness and the same way higher specific leaf area. It means that they are producing thinner leaves and they utilize the same amount of biomass to obtain the higher leaf area. The higher leaf area, the more sunlight you catch and you are more competitive. Also, they invest in less persistent but cheaper to develop wood with lower density. They found that this species realize try harder strategy in contrast to join the local strategy. So they are functionally not similar, but have a functional advantage over the native species. It was inspiration to look on our terrible trio of invasive tree species in Poland: Prunus serotina, Robinia pseudoacacia, and Quercus rubra. We collected seedlings of this species and of 4 native tree species, and we compared the traits distribution, looking into traits intraspecific variability, because we know that the mean value of trait did not necessarily cover the whole range of the realized life strategies. We found that they both join the local or try harder, depending on the species, on the strategy and the organs. For example, Prunus serotina and Robinia pseudoacacia try far harder in terms of leaves ecology, while Quercus rubra tries harder in terms of total biomass and root ecology. So we need to account not only for the mean values, but also for plasticity. Unfortunately, in the trait databases, if we want to extrapolate this for the wider pool of species, we very frequently have a few species where we have a lot of measurements that we can estimate the level of plasticity, the level of intraspecific variability. But for many species, we already have no traits. And also, we have much more species that we have only few measurements, which give us some clue about the position, but not about variability. Therefore, there is no universal rule for all invasive trees. And instead of Holy Grail, we received something like that, like the not very well product, which has a very limited use and very limited look. Therefore, we need still more studies on the traits of invasive species. But this is for predicting which species can be invasive. Usually, we know which species are invasive because they already are and are making us troubles. We can focus on the characteristics of recipient ecosystem, on species invasibility, because if we compare Białowieża State Reserve with some random forest in Wielkopolska, we know that here the level of invasion is much, much lower than in very managed, transformed forests. We need to know what makes the difference. Resources, interactions, dynamics over time. There are many factors, but looking only on invasibility without taking into account a propagal pressure don't give us a full image. Propagal pressure can be expressed in many ways. It can be number of parental trees growing outside, seed production, number, biomass, basal area, and many other metrics to quantify, or rather to approximate the propagal pressure. The more propagal pressure we have, the higher we have probability of establishment. So propagal pressure is very important. Usually we have more than one group of factors that affect the distributions. And also these affect sometimes mask each other or are confounding. For example, we have a model where we have effect of one factor that is complex and not account for example, direct light availability measures. If we would like to do it, the most proper way, giving us the most robust results, we need experiments. However, to establish an experiment that is in line with the modern statistical guidelines, we need a lot of time. You know how long trees can live. So if we plant now the trees in the design that we could utilize, maybe next generation can give some conclusions. Also, this is in terms of money, we all know how underfinanced is science, and also about ability to control changing environment. We live in the times of global changes, not only climate change, and the design suitable for now might be not suitable future. What can we do? We can take an advantage of natural experiments, which are the accidentally invaded systems of experiments designed for something else or just common garden conditions, or we can carefully design observational study to get conclusions. And therefore, further, I will talk about both propagal pressure and invasibility jointly. One of the examples, I think very close to our hearts, would be Prunus terracifera. This is a tree species growing in the allotment gardens because it's cherry plum. These fruits are not very tasty. They are better when cooked like juice, jam, or fermented. In 2022, with Patrick, we make a very standard, boring examination of understory vegetation in the strict reserve. And we found this species, natural regeneration in 15 of 30 study plots. And we also found the fruiting specimen there. It was a big shock for us, but we have some data. The design of the data collection was random, so we have no prior expectations or subjectivity. We decided to look into the drivers. We found that Prunus terracifera in our regional Poznań and Kociewie dialect, Glubka, has higher probability of establishment in the plots with more light-demanding species, with more species in the understory, but when the diversity of phylogenetic lineages and functional dispersion are low. So these are sites that are more or less disturbed, but there is some kind of filtering that support some lineages or some functional groups. More about this exciting tree will tell Patrick in the next lecture, so I will not spoil much more. And I will tell you about another study where we used the system not designed as experiment, but we use it as natural experiment. It was in Rogów Arboretum, where there are study plots with different tree species, and fortunately, black cherry was not introduced there in the radius of 2 or 3 kilometers around. Therefore, the only propagule source was here. It is a stand of black cherry from 1930s, very high trees. So we have opportunity to look the dispersal. And with the increasing distance from the seed source, we found decreasing probability of occurrence, also decreasing density. And what was the most interesting, the interaction between coniferous, broadleafs, and mixed stands. In each of these stands, the invisibility connected with the forest type changed this pattern. Why? Because coniferous stands usually transmit much more light than broadleafed. Another interesting interaction is from Siemianice experimental forest. There was an experiment designed to observe the early growth of 14 tree species in total common garden. It was very carefully designed, but after 10 years, researchers abandoned it, and we have data from 2014 and 2005, and we found the above ground biomass increased with light availability. But this pattern was also mediated by propagule pressure, because the positive effect of light availability was much higher if the propagule pressure expressed by number of fruiting Prunus serotina individuals 50 meters around plot was higher. So also it has some implications for management. We wanted to know what is more important, propagule pressure, light availability, or tree species. So interactions between invisibility and invasiveness. We can use tools that were not available 20 or 30 years ago to see how much variability is explained by each factor, and also what are the interactions. Propagule pressure, here expressed as basal area of parental trees, was the most important driver of invasive trees' natural regeneration biomass, which means the ability of spread for this terrible trio, also in Wielkopolski National Park. This park is a national park, but it was heavily transformed before it became a national park. And this national park has a very not nice record of the number of invasive tree species in national parks. So controlling the resources availability, we still can see the increasing role of basal area. Why this regeneration is important? Because the more seedlings we have, the higher chance we have that it will be an adult and will be spread further. It's so important because the success of natural regeneration is very low. I labeled 11,000 seedlings of this invasive tree species, and after 1 year I assessed the survival of them. Prunus serotina had a survival rate about 4%. It was quite high because native species survival rate, it was tested on the smaller subset, was about 1 promille. Ficus rubra had amazing survival rate, about 10%. But Robinia, I labeled more than 4,000 seedlings, and literally 5 of them survived. What does it mean? For Robinia, in forests, generative reproduction is not so important like as the vegetative reproduction. Also, the propagular pressure was driver of survival for both Prunus serotina and Quercus rubia. We can therefore tell that propagular pressure mediates all of these processes related to the presence of its natural regeneration positively, because the more fruiting trees we have more seeds and then seedlings. However, parents are competing with their children for resources, especially for the light, decreasing, as you can see here and here, the survival of natural regeneration. And we have this mechanism of the invasion. First, when we don't have many adults producing seeds, we have very high increase in the seedling survival, but not so quick rate of the number of seedlings. But then these two factors are going to be in the dynamic equilibrium. I say that Prunus terracifera in a strict reserve was a rare example. I have another example of overlooked alien shrub species. This is Sorb aronia michurini. The taxonomy of this monster is really complicated because it was a hybrid of two aronia species crossed with the Sorbus aucoparia and back crossed with aronia and planted in this place. 4 hectares of plantation that was abandoned. And here we have a very nice system because we have post-agricultural Scots pine plantations, very uniform conditions. So another natural experiment. And we can see all of these spatial patterns with decrease towards the invasion front, with the light and distance as main drivers of biomass and density. Talking about invasions, I would like also stress out the effect of time, especially time since introduction to the first naturalization and from first record of naturalization to the exponential spread. In this time, we usually not detect that we have a problem. And then, when we detect, we already have a big problem. Therefore, for each risk assessment, there's a big question whether we are in this point, this point, this point, or this point. And this is a risk connected with introducing non-native trees and shrubs. This lag time can, for trees and shrubs, be very long. Like you can see, Juglans regia, the walnut, 200 years, for Robinia 150 years. The interesting example is Prunus serotina that have only 30 years. So when someone tells now that it is safe to introduce, let's say, Tuya occidentalis or Douglas fir because it's not invasive, we need to bear in mind that for 50 years or 100 years, we can have a big problem. Also, the pool of non-native species worldwide is not saturated. It means that we still have increasing numbers of detected biological invasions. And for all of these effects, we should also consider something that we felt in this week, the climate change. We worked also with species distribution models of invasive trees. Here you can see an example for Robinia pseudoacacia that is predicted to expand its climatic optimum towards north and east and lose some climatic optimum in the place where it has a very high importance for forest management. What I would like to stress out. If you compare prediction for 2050 and 2070, it's not so big. So we don't have too much time to act in terms of climate change. This pattern is also clear for native tree species. We also predicted these trends for 12 most popular invasive tree species in Europe. And we found some trends in range climatic optimum contraction and expansion. And you can see that more or less broadleaf tree species are predicted to increase the climatic optimum, while conifers, which are perceived by many people as a solution for climate change because we plant non-native conifers, they will accumulate quickly a lot of carbon, especially in our part of Europe, are predicted to lose climatic optimum. So it's not the solution. There are also some interesting exceptions, like Prunus serotina and Quercus rubra, that will lose a bit more. Unfortunately, Prunus serotina will not lose climatic optimum in Poland, but Quercus rubra in some part of Poland could. So this is general pattern, conifers versus broadleaves. But if we want to go to the traits, we can see that traits of the species are quite nice predictors of predicted range contraction and expansion. So using traits, we can extrapolate these trends for species with not so good described distributions. Also, when we have more invasive species, we have more impacts. This is a kind of the Russian roulette. So, you know, the 1 bullet and 5 empty slots, because we don't know how invasive species will interact with each other. We can have assumption of the Gaussian model that some impacts are positive, some are negative, but this not account for interactions among species. And there are two concepts. One of them is invasional meltdown. When one invasive species is changing environment that much that another invasive species are facilitated in their spread. And also there are environmental triggers that can wake up sleepers, the invasive species already in lag phase. The example is Juglans regia, the walnut that was planted in the gardens, but in the last 20, 30 years, it started spreading. If we have more interactions, the model becomes more complex and our predictable power becomes lower. And I would like to say that all of these predictions about the spread of invasive species are rather the best case optimistic scenario because they not include interactions. I told some about impacts. We are afraid of the impacts of invasive species because there's a lot of them, and most of them are negative. There's a lot of studies, and there are also some syntheses. Most of the studies focus on the very simple design, non-invaded versus invaded forests. And these studies serve for categorizations of impact, for quantifications. And you can see here the review of field studies of ecological impacts of invasive plants by Villa and co-authors. If you look on this gray zone, there are cases where authors not detected any significant impacts. Also, we have some negative impacts, positive impacts. This is the proportion, but if you will go into details in these papers, you will see that many fields are not sufficiently studied. And main message from this paper is that we still study the same species. Me too, also usually dealing with this terrible trio. Therefore, we need more studies on species that are not very well known because they are still surprising us, like Glubka in Strict Reserve or Sorbaronia. If we go deeper into the impacts, we can see that most of studies concentrate on few groups of focal native species groups, but we have a huge gaps especially lichens, bryophytes, but also birds and mammals are very, very insufficiently studied in terms of their vulnerability to invasive species. And even if you look on impacts of vascular plants, you can see a very huge gray zone. So we study Robinia. Robinia is is one of the 5 the most studied invasive plants in Europe, and still we don't know. Still, we have not a clear impact because biological invasions are context dependent, and people use different reference ecosystems to compare. In my studies, I compared the impact of the terrible trio with different types of native vegetation, different concepts. And you can see that I used 2 types of pinus forest. Nutrient-poor natural habitats where Scots pine occurs naturally, and plantations where Scots pine have been introduced in the sites typical of broad-leaved forests. And the impacts between these 2 Scots pine forests differ in terms of alpha diversity, taxonomic, phylogenetic, and functional, as well as in qualitative approach using the ecological groups of species. For example, we can see that Robinia is quite good in terms of providing ancient forest indicator species, the same as in oak hornbeam forest, and much more than in Fagus sylvatica forest. If we use Fagus as a reference, or oak hornbeam forest, we will go to totally different conclusions, because we can say that it is better to plant Robinia to nurse ancient forest indicator species compared to Fagus species. The clearest image we have in terms of Ficus rubra. But for Robinia, we have more species, and it not necessarily means that this is more alien species. However, plantations of Prunus serotina, plantations of pinus with Prunus serotina had the higher number of alien species, and this is one of the proofs for invasional meltdown. We also studied epigeic bryophytes, and we found not very big differences. Why we have not very big differences here? Because in the model we controlled light availability, but still it's interesting to see that on pinus plantations with Prunus serotina we had more species of bryophytes than in pinus plantations without. Also, on the pinus poor sites, it's not statistically significant, but this is the difference of more or less 1 species. It is also more. However, if we look for the cover, there are totally different trends. So sometimes these impacts are very hard to distinguish, or sometimes we can see something, but if we control for another factor, the differences become much less clear. Also, we found some impacts of natural regeneration. For example, species typical of broadleaf forest had better natural regeneration densities in oak hornbeam forest than Robinia forest. Prunus serotina also had negative impact on pinus plantations on Acer platanoides, but positive on Carpinus betulus. Some of the trends are not very clear. For example, Ulmus minor, which is in regress in Europe because of the Dutch elm disease, had much higher regeneration densities. I would say that almost 6-fold than in oak hornbeam forest. Why? Because Robinia is adding more nitrogen to the soil. We need to go with assessments at the level of individual species because species are so different. Here's another example of Vaccinium myrtillus, the bilberry, affected by red oak. We have different trends in ancient and recent forests, but if you look on the fruit number, the ecosystem service produced by bilberry per square meter, it's drastically decreased with the presence of ancient forests. So this species is really vulnerable. Also, regarding nutrient pools, we have differences on the decomposition rate, differences in terms of the liter nitrogen pool. I will not tell about this more because Paweł Horodecki has a lecture about decomposition, because this is based on the traits and liter measurement. And Paweł have a real experiment with the liter bags. What we need? We need to go into the impacts in the gradient of the invasion, not to take the two sides, black and white, but all shades of the gray. And this is what we're doing with Sebastian now in the project, because we focus on so-called per capita effect of biological invasions, which is impact per unit of abundance. There are not many studies that affect these gray zones. There are different metrics of abundance. I will skip this a bit. Before the project, we have two preliminary approaches. First was with the system with Sorbaronia. And we found that with increasing biomass of Sorbaronia, soil chemistry, litter chemistry, light availability, and understory diversity are clearly affected, and we found nice negative effects, what we expected. But when we took the data not designed for that, but designed for something else, and we applied this concept, we received a very blurred effects of Prunus serotina proportion in the biomass on understory composition and diversity, showing slight and positive effects. Therefore, we designed a new study to carefully cover the gradient of invasive species in terms of biomass to account for two habitat contexts: nutrient poor sites, where Prunus and Robinia were introduced massively till the 1980s, and nutrient-rich habitats where the species are optimal. And also we included two management contexts. 160 plots, hard to find in the field because of hard to find Robinia, Pinus sylvestris forest with Robinia, but without Prunus serotina, another proof for invasional meltdown. And this is the invasion gradient. We have up to 150 tons per hectare of Robinia in Scots pine forest and up to 280 in oak forest. With Prunus serotina, much shorter gradient because Prunus serotina is usually a shrub or very small tree. One outlier that we had to exclude because it was 3 times higher than the second highest value. What we did, okay, not what we did, what Sebastian did. Sebastian drilled the trees, assessed the increment for the last 5 years, calculated it as biomass increment at the tree level and stand level. And the impact of invasion gradient expressed by different colors not affected the usual relationships between the age or the size of the trees. So we found no impact of invasive trees on native trees increments in the invasion gradient. We also placed some data loggers. There were 72, but some animals and people stole some of them, and we finished with the n equals 41, measuring a lot of parameters, and still the effects of the microclimate scales with the biomass of invasive species, like the mean air temperature increases with an increase of Robinia biomass and decreases then, and Prunus serotina biomass increases the maximum air temperature in the winter, but decreases in the summer. We still need to delve deeper into these results, but I would like to show you that these effects are quite nice, scalable across the gradient of invaders. We also assessed epigeic bryophytes, and we found that on nutrient-rich sites, well, usually we have not many bryophytes, so it was quite accepted. There were no effect of studied invaders, but on nutrient-poor sites, the more invader, the lower biomass of bryophytes, the lower cover, and in case of Robinia, the lower richness. We also found the individualistic responses of particular species, and we found that most of species that showed any trend decreased with the increase in invasive species abundance. And Sebastian will tell you much more about effects of understory vegetation. We also found impacts on natural regeneration are scalable with the invaded biomass. We compared 3 methods, and usually we have a very consistent trends, ordinations, Titan II, and models. So these trends are quite easy to detect and quite important if we want to go to retention forest, to close to nature silviculture. We know which level is decreasing the natural regeneration of native tree species. We want to do, and I will go towards the end of presentation, but we usually don't know what to do because invasion is a time-extended process, and we have different phases of the biological invasion. At the first phase, crucial thing is the prevention and not being charmed that invasive species can be not harmful, because we have lag phase. So very critical and important thing is reporting, monitoring. I ask every of you, if you see some strange thing, you don't know what is this, make a photo, upload on iNaturalist, and it will help the community to do something with that. You will say eradication, let's cut all Robinia. But eradication, although is possible theoretically in all further phases of invasion, it's not usually possible. It is easy if you have very small population early detected, but if we have case of Robinia or Prunus in the whole country for the long time, and also people get used for it. Don't forget about the social dimension, because people like some invasive species and are not happy if somebody wants to remove it. Also, management effectiveness, because the species usually resprout, and sometimes this is about a lesser evil. To keep a small amount of Robinia or to use a herbicide or very frequent harvesting to remove it. The most important thing is containment and mitigation, which means cutting off one of the elements of this invasion triangle. Generally, in management, we should focus on decreasing invasibility and propagule pressure, and we need to go to case-specific management, favoring native species. If it's needed quickly, rapid eradication is fine, but we can go to step-by-step conversion by retention forest, shelter wood system, or we can leave it for natural succession, favoring native species. Finishing, basic studies on invasion. Sometimes people say, oh, it's basic study, it's nothing new, novel, another invasive species. We still needed to check what is the species niche, what is the level of competition, what is productivity of the invasive species. Productivity is connected with seed production or vegetative reproduction. What is dispersal capacity, what is the impact, and only when we know all of this chain, we can take effective actions to prevent, control, and manage. And I argue, if you want to study invasive species, go out from the comfort zone, go to the not known invasive species and not known target group of impacted organisms. Thank you.